Okay, we are now recording, and I just again, we posted a video on this section on government regulation of business. It's been posted to the Blackboard page on the unit on regulation of business. And so I would urge you, I went through the discussion questions in pretty good detail, I think, when I recorded that video. We really begin to, in this lecture, begin to look at the constitutional basis for the federal government's regulation of business, as we have been discussing, especially in the areas of disability and discrimination. The idea being is, especially if you begin to consider and look at it from what I will say is a states' rights perspective, what business does the federal government have in enacting federal legislation that outlaws discrimination, i.e. Jim Crow laws that supported segregation in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and of course with disability. How can you force companies, businesses to do the hiring in the way that we have suggested is necessary to do to avoid running afoul of these federal statutes. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act is a good example. I didn't have time to discuss this in the lecture I posted, in the video I posted, but I do enjoy talking about this. That it's the 1964 Civil Rights Act, of course, outlaws, that we know, discrimination in employment based upon certain protected categories: race, religion, creed, national origin, sex, pregnancy. And we also know that, and that, of course, I think I discussed a little bit of the background. That civil rights legislation, I think, is a legacy of Lyndon Johnson that's overlooked in the way that and the Voting Rights Act, in a way that changed this country immensely. And of course, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was challenged when it was enacted. It was passed by Congress. Johnson did have the Democratic Congress that was supportive of the legislation, although it was very difficult because many of the members of the Senate and the House from the South were Democrats, believe it or not. At one time, the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, were a real force to be reckoned with. Now, of course, the Southern allegiance, I think, this political landscape has changed to support more of a Republican slant. But even then, those Dixiecrats, those Southern Democrats, were very mired in the support of segregation in the South. In their states. And so it was a real work of political know-how and acumen to be able to use the influence Lyndon Johnson had and the connections he had made when he was in the House and the Senate representing Texas, by the way, that enabled him to get the legislation, the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passed, and he signed it. And so that's a real accomplishment. Now, of course, that act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, was immediately challenged in the courts, in the federal courts. And of course, the idea being that not everyone was going to accept the fact that the federal government could pass a law that would require businesses in, say, Atlanta, Georgia, to end desegregation and public accommodation. We've talked about employment, and segregation and discrimination in employment, but the 1964 Civil Rights Act and other areas also addressed the issue of segregation and accommodation in public transportation. And of course, that was a big part of Jim Crow, not just employment, but also the idea that we would have segregated facilities that could impact public accommodation, i.e. hotels and motels, and public transportation, i.e. buses and trains and things of that nature. And of course, the proponents of segregation and these Jim Crow laws challenged the 1964 Civil Rights Act in federal court. The case was known as the Heart of Atlanta motel case. And it was filed in federal district court in Atlanta by the owners of a Fleabag segregated whites-only hotel in downtown Atlanta, challenging the application of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, banning discrimination and accommodation, that is, banning segregation and accommodation, saying essentially that does not apply to me. Now, here's the argument that the proprietors of the owners of the Heart of Atlanta hotel made. And there was testimony on this, evidence on this, that was presented to the court, and the record was made that the Heart of Atlanta motel was indeed a whites-only transient hotel, and short-term, shall we say, hotel in Atlanta, Fleabag, but it was whites-only. And the owner said that, look, we have essentially provide accommodations to people that are residents of the city of Atlanta, generally on a short-term basis, that all of my employees are residents of the city of Atlanta, that all of the individuals, the suppliers of goods and services are located here in Atlanta. In other words, my laundry service is here located in Atlanta. My catering service, the people that provide me with food for my dining room and lunch counter are all located here in Atlanta. They're locally owned businesses. And I will grant you the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, which we discussed, provides that Congress has the ability to regulate interstate commerce. But guess what? I'm not involved in interstate commerce. My commerce is all localized. That is, it's all intrastate. That's all my business activity that I do. From my guess, even though there was a little bit of dispute on that because it was located near some nice national highways not too far, a few blocks from some national highways, but predominantly the guests were what? Local individuals that needed short-term accommodations, needed a white flea bag hotel, kind of envision the YMCA type of a setup. That all my employees were residents of the city of Atlanta. They may all be white, but they were all local residents. That all my suppliers were located here in Atlanta. That all my, on and on and on, right? And therefore, this is solely a localized economic activity. And therefore, the Commerce Clause, remember the Commerce Clause? We talked about that, I think, in the prior lecture, and it's in the discussion question that says that what? That says that Congress has the ability to regulate interstate commerce. I'm not engaged in interstate commerce, says the owners of the Heart of Atlanta Hotel. I'm engaged in what? In interstate commerce, right? Okay, everybody understand the argument and that is being made here and it was of course an attempt to undercut entirely the breadth and the reach of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Okay, and it was it's a pretty brilliant argument, right? But it's one that had been made for quite a while, quite frankly, throughout the years when lawyers have been discussing these issues. But that's the argument that was made. Everybody understand that? Questions about the argument? Now let's go on to what the Supreme Court did. The federal court upheld the constitutionality of the constitutionality of the law. It went on up after the record was made. It went on to the Court of Appeals and eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. And of course, we also know which body is appointed by the Constitution to determine whether any particular act of Congress, that is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, is Constitution. Which body has the final say on that? The United States Constitution, or the United States Supreme Court, excuse me. Those 9 justices, right? If a majority of them, 5 of them, believe that an act of Congress is constitutional, then guess what? It's constitutional. And we also find out that by virtue of what we call the Supremacy Clause, remember that? That says that the Constitution and the laws of the United States are the supreme law of the land. And if Congress chooses to act in an area and that action is constitutional, then guess what? It's the law of the land. And in fact, when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, segregation was part and parcel of state law and constitutional law in states like Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama. And very interestingly, only recently did Mississippi, I believe, and Alabama eliminate the language in their constitutions that said that segregation was the law of the land in those states. Everybody understand that they, even though that language in their constitution was illegal by virtue of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it still stayed there, kind of like as a protest. It was just there. And eventually, I think it became such an embarrassment to that language in the Constitution and the statutes, I think that eventually those states did move to repeal and eliminate those those state constitutional segregation mandates from the statutes and from their constitutions. But it lingered around for a long time, right? All right. Questions? Now, I want to talk about what the Supreme Court said when it looked at what the owners of Heart of Atlanta had proposed, had said that why this doesn't apply to them. And I'm a big baseball fan. I'm a baseball nut. I love baseball. I have to confess that in the early 2000s, when I had the time and the money to do it, I was attending 115, 20 games a year, St. Louis Cardinal baseball games, and of course a lot of games in Chicago and Milwaukee and Cincinnati, Kansas City, and I actually had the privilege of becoming acquainted with and a Negro Leagues baseball player by the name of Buck O'Neill. And if you want to, he was quite frankly, he was well advanced in age when I had the opportunity to meet him and sit down and actually have some meals and some discussion, listen to some stories with him. He was a national treasure about the Negro Leagues, and of course, the Negro Leagues were part of the whole Jim Crow thing, and National Baseball. Of course, National League Baseball did not become segregated until Jackie Robinson made his appearance with the Dodgers, and that color line was broken. Now, what does that have to do with Heart of Atlanta Motel? Well, the Supreme Court and actually the folks that represented the government and also the NAACP with the amicus briefs made the record quite clear and documented very well for the Supreme Court what happened to Negro athletes when they attempted to travel in the segregated Jim Crow South, and quite frankly, there was segregation in the North too. But the whole idea that the people like Jackie Robinson, baseball players like him, and some of the players that followed, Roy Campanella, and that those players, that when that baseball team went on the road and appeared and traveled in cities, and this was also it was documented with the Negro Leagues, that indeed there were absolutely none accommodations for people of color in segregated cities. And in fact, there's a very interesting, I learned about this recently. There's a very interesting pamphlet or booklet called the Green Book, which was a guide to people of color about boarding houses that would welcome people of color in segregated cities. And of course, we all were well aware of the difficulties people of color had traveling on buses and interstate travel. And that was all well documented in the trial court about just what effect these Jim Crow laws on accommodation and public travel had on the ability of people of color to travel interstate in this country. And quite frankly, that was the whole point of segregation to a great extent in accommodation and public travel. It was to do what? Yeah. And I don't need to be crude or rude about it, but certainly the whole point of Jim Crow was to keep people of color down home where their labor was needed to prevent them actually from traveling in interstate commerce, to make it as difficult as possible for them to get up off and at that point it would have been sharecropping, the farms where they were sharecropping to get off of those farms and those sharecropping where the labor was desperately needed to support the quote-unquote white economy, and to keep them from leaving, and also then to make it as difficult as possible to keep people from the north of color from traveling down south and disseminating the idea that somehow or another they should be looking to move up north and then thus get off the farm, off the sharecrop. And really, that's what, in great part, that's what it was about. And nothing better demonstrated the difficulty that people had of color in traveling than the Negro baseball players, both in Negro leagues and with Jackie Robinson and all the early players that broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. The record was quite replete that special efforts had been made to house Mr. Robinson, Jackie Robinson, in separate accommodations from those of his white teammates. They could not, they were not able to stay together. They very often were not able to share meals together. For crying out loud, and so that whole idea of the difficulty that those baseball players had in traveling in segregated areas of the country. Cincinnati, for one, for instance, had a baseball team there, and that team resisted integration and fought it fiercely. And again, Jackie Robinson had very real difficulties in finding accommodations anywhere near the ballpark in Cincinnati. Indeed, the special arrangements had to be made for him and other players. And here's what the Supreme Court said. We recognize that. And we recognize that imposing travel restrictions on people of color is one of the main purposes and points of segregation and Jim Crow. And while we acknowledge that the heart of Atlanta, that their commerce may be localized, their segregation is not. Let me say that again. The Supreme Court said the segregation and the effects of segregation that the heart of Atlanta was trying to uphold and maintain did have effects far beyond the city borders of Atlanta or the state of Georgia. And the Supreme Court analogized it to segregation as dropping a pebble in a pond of water. What happens? What happens when the pebble hits the pond of water? Yeah, there are ripples. There are ripples that emanate out from where the pebble struck the water. And those ripples do not obey or recognize artificial borders like city lines or state lines, that they keep going and going and going. And that ripple effect of segregation does indeed impede interstate commerce. And therefore, Congress has the absolute right to regulate segregation, to outlaw Jim Crow. It's found in its powers in the Commerce Clause. Remember, in that prior lecture I posted that I'm sure I made the point over and over again that Congress has the exclusive right to regulate interstate commerce, and no state has the ability to impose artificial restrictions that impede the flow of commerce between the states. Okay, and what the court said, segregation does that. Segregation clearly imposes the flow of people and goods and ideas, right, across state lines. And so based upon that, then I said the Commerce Clause gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, the exclusive power to do that. Segregation has a direct and immediate effect on interstate commerce. Therefore, Congress has the right to do that. And by virtue of the Supremacy Clause, remember, if Congress acts and it's a constitutional act, then guess what? It's a supreme law of the land. And by virtue of that Supreme Court decision, then all of the Jim Crow laws regarding accommodation and employment and public transportation were struck down and deemed to be void, even though that what? Those were laws that were part of state constitutions and state law. Okay? That's an important, from my point of view, an important point to understand. Hello? Okay. Buzzwords for this next upcoming exam. Okay, of course, are going to be what? Commerce Clause and Supremacy Clause. Hello. Okay. Questions? That's one of my favorite stories. I love that story because of the baseball tie that the Supreme Court looked at something a lot of us wouldn't think about. Travel of black baseball players of color. In interstate commerce and the difficulties they faced, and just how real those problems were. And it illustrated what Jim Crow was all about. Okay. Anybody got any questions? Huh? You get, yeah, it's, sometimes you have to wait for the punchline. That one of the things I like about this is that we bring together some disparate ends to kind of illustrate how this stuff works. And yeah, yeah, it's good to check, make sure that everybody's kind of catching on. That sometimes my thinking style then is a little bit different. It's not real linear at times, but that's okay. Right? I have fun. I enjoy it. Okay. Ryan says he understands that. Anybody else got any questions about that? Is anybody having problems with Buffalo Creek? I know there was a little bit of stuff going on with that. I want to make sure everybody understands and what they're supposed to do. And also one other thing, there is no correct set of answers with this set of discussion questions. I think between the lectures and your ability, I'm recording this and I'll post this, but your ability to ask me questions and stuff, it's kind of redundant. You should be able to figure it out with, and of course I'll be available to answer things on the discussion question. I do apologize if I didn't get to check the discussion board. I think there was one or two questions I didn't get to last time, but I'm sorry about that. How are the slopes? Slopes are great. I got 3 days so far. I skied last Friday, last Sunday, and yesterday at Alta. Got about 10,000 vertical foot each day. Bluebird days on Sunday and Monday, which means the sky's not a cloud in the sky, and the blue out here when you get it 10,000, 11,000 feet is unbelievable. And there's storms coming in. I got to work again tomorrow. I got stuff I have to do and accomplish tomorrow, but I'm going to go back up on Thursday. And we're supposed to have snow for the next 5 or 6 days. And so I'm excited. I'm like a little kid. Okay. All right. Any other questions? I've been on here about a half hour, which is about right. Okay. I will be posting more videos. I may actually, one of the things I may do tomorrow is post another video on some of the next lectures, so you guys can get started on that. And also, I will post some lecture, I think, on Buffalo Creek. I want to do that too. Okay. Anybody else got anything they want to raise, talk about? Again, I thought the grades on the last exam are really good as a whole. So I look forward to to seeing more of these, 110 out of 110 scores, 107 out of 110, that kind of stuff. Okay. Counting down. One last time. Once again. We good? All right, then I'm signing off. I'm going to go have some dinner. Maybe take a hot tub too. Ooh, that sounds good, right? See you guys.